Vietnam. So just like LBJ is going to maintain other aspects of Kennedy's administration, he is also going to maintain Kennedy's commitment to South Vietnam. In fact, we're going to see a stepping up of commando raids and specifically like naval shelling of North Vietnam. And a lot of this was on this assumption that North Vietnam basically controlled the Viet Cong. Now, this was incorrect, but it was on that assumption. In August of 1964, we're going to see North Vietnamese are going to torpedo and attack the United States destroyer Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, while the Maddox was basically eavesdropping on North Vietnamese military signals. 2 days later, the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy are going to report another torpedo attack. Now, most likely this was actually false sonar readings. That was pretty common during that day and age. In fact, my father-in-law served in the Navy in the Vietnam War, and at one point he talked about how he could pick up dolphins with their like sonar and everything like that, and he could send back little beeps to the dolphins and they would talk back and forth. And at one point he was caught by his commanding officer who said, "Elkins, what are you doing?" And of course he had to respond, "Talking to dolphins, sir." He was told that if he ever talked to dolphins again, he'd be swimming with them. So there's very much, that's pretty standard for that day and age. LBJ, though, because of these reports of another torpedo attack, LBJ is going to order a bombing raid basically in reprisal. He also asks Congress to authorize basically all necessary measures to protect the United States forces and stop further aggression. They are going to pass the Gulf Tonkin Resolution. This effectively authorized the president to wage an undeclared war. We never declared war outright in Vietnam, but clearly we're going to wage war there. In fact, we even use the draft and everything. Now, as much as you see militancy in Johnson's administration, it pales in comparison to his Republican opponent come the election of 1964. His Republican opponent was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. And his campaign made LBJ look like a moderate because LBJ was trying to pledge not to send, American boys thousands and thousands of miles from home over to Asia, and in his words, doing something that Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. This election was a landslide for LBJ. He actually won 61% of the popular vote. And we see Democrats also rack up 2-to-1 majorities in Congress. Now, the reason this is so important is because it basically means that Democrats could enact their domestic program without having to beg votes from like conservatives or Southerners or like Republicans and such. So LBJ passes through a series of measures, at least until the Vietnam War is really going to erode his political standing. We are going to see Vietnam comes back and really bites LBJ. So this domestic program included things like the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, which were really uncontroversial at the time. The Wilderness Act of 1964, this actually preserved 9.1 million acres from development. A lot of this, as well as other parts of this domestic reform, was like increasing opportunity for all Americans. So it's things like you get the Elementary and Secondary Act, which were the first general federal aid program for schools, for public schools. Then you get the Medical Care Act, which creates Medicare, which is federally funded health insurance for the elderly, and Medicaid, which helps states offer medical care to the poor. But now we have to come back to Vietnam. So in 1965 in Pleiku, this is the site of the South Vietnamese Army headquarters, and it was basically a United States military base. What happens is on February 7th of that year, the Viet Cong would attack the United States base, and they actually kill 8 Americans and wound about 100 other people. And so you get ambassadors and generals recommending to, like, LBJ to have a retaliatory airstrike against the North Vietnamese. Once again, this is saying this was under the belief that the North Vietnamese really controlled the Viet Cong, and that wasn't necessarily the case. LBJ is going to concur with these officials, and so that's when you get Operation Flaming Dart, and a month later you get a full-scale air offensive against the North Vietnamese called Rolling Thunder. Now, the official reason for these bombings was basically trying to pressure North Vietnam to negotiate to end the war. So it wasn't necessarily trying to take over North Vietnam or anything. It was trying to bring them to the negotiation table. But other things are going on in South Vietnam. For instance, the South Vietnamese government basically lost control of the countryside. And so airstrikes had basically looked like an easy way to redress this balance. Also keep in mind, there's this element of America needed to, like, prove its toughness. Plus, they were under the mistaken assumption that China was aggressively backing the North Vietnamese, like during the Korean War and everything. These airstrikes really are taking America from, rather than before when America was propping up the South Vietnamese government who was leading the war effort, now America is really leading the war effort. Now, LBJ, he did want a way out of all of this, yet he kept having to add United States forces. And part of this is, once again, he was not good with foreign policy. And part of it's also, once again, that he's kind of continuing on with Kennedy's administration's ideas and such. And that had been started by Kennedy on some level. Now, when it comes to LBJ and how involved he was in Vietnam, advisors are basically going to convince him that the United States should have a controlled military escalation. And this was actually seen really as like a middle course, because one side would be complete withdrawal, but that might make the United States look weak in the grand scheme of like the Cold War and everything. And the other side would be, full on all out war, which could be very dangerous because it could potentially lead to a World War III and et cetera, et cetera. And so they want this kind of middle route of controlled military escalation, and they convince LBJ this way they could secure Vietnam. However, these officials, as well as LBJ, really failed to understand, first of all, there was a lot of popular opposition against the South Vietnamese government in Saigon. They also didn't understand the willingness of the North Vietnamese to basically sacrifice in order to achieve national unity. Nothing America did would bring the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. And so defeat is looming, and so this ends up with LBJ like doubling the draft calls to increase United States combat troops. And so once again, we're seeing the South Vietnamese War be turned into a United States war. In fact, by 1967, the United States forces in South Vietnam totaled about 485,000. That's not even the maximum, though. We'd actually hit maximum number of troops over in South Vietnam in August of 1969, and that's going to be about 543,000. A lot of the United States strategy in Vietnam was to like search and destroy the opposition using sophisticated surveillance as well as heavily armed patrols. And so what they would do is they would locate these like enemy detachments, and then they could destroy them a lot of times through airstrikes. And then you'd have artillery and reinforcements sent in by like helicopter. Now the thing is, this kind of strategy makes sense when you have an opposition that consists of like entire North Vietnamese troops, like battalions, etc., or like large Viet Cong units. And so like it works well when it's in the sparsely populated Drang Valley. But most of the opponents were not North Vietnamese divisions. Most of them were the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters. The Viet Cong avoided these kinds of set-piece battles. And so they also blended into South Vietnamese society. And so this forced the United States to make these repeated sweeps through like farms and villages. And it was really difficult for them to recognize who exactly was the enemy among like farmers and workers. And sometimes like the Viet Cong could include like children and everything. And so this really makes the South Vietnamese society itself one of the targets. And it didn't help that the United States had a penchant for like massive firepower. I mean, think about all the funding has been going into atomic bombs. And while we're not going to use an atomic bomb here, there's an element of wanting to use that kind of technology and everything. And so this kind of firepower killed thousands of Vietnamese and made millions of others refugees. And on top of that, American troops were really unable to secure areas even after multiple sweeps. Oftentimes, the Viet Cong would just reappear in an area that Americans had already gone through. When it comes to air war, America is going to have limited results. They drop a vast tonnage of bombs, specifically on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which basically you can see here were the supply routes from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The thing is, while this damaged tons of roads, these roads were repaired fairly quickly. A lot of this air assault also remained diplomatic. It was intended for the North Vietnamese to basically stop interfering in this civil war basically taking place within South Vietnam itself. But North Vietnam found this unacceptable because they viewed South Vietnam as a part of their country, that it was just one all-united Vietnam. And so we're going to see the United States really runs out of targets.